The first crack appeared at 11 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday morning, and Dr. Ilara Sung almost missed it. She was kneeling on the conservation room floor of the Vanthil Gallery, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and her hands gloved in nitrile, brushing centuries of accumulated varnish residue from the corner of a display case that held nothing important. Routine maintenance. The kind of work that junior conservators should have been doing, except that Ilara had fired her last junior conservator 6 weeks ago for using a solvent grade that could have stripped the original pigment from a Tessarine star map, and the replacement hadn't started yet. So here she was, head curator of the largest xenoarchaeological collection on Earth, on her knees with a brush, cleaning display glass like an intern on her first day. The Vanthil occupied the top 3 floors of what had once been a federal customs warehouse on the Boston waterfront, a brutalist concrete block that some architect in the 2030s had gutted and rebuilt with climate-controlled galleries, filtered skylights, and enough environmental monitoring equipment to make a hospital jealous. The conversion had preserved the warehouse's bones: load-bearing walls 3 feet thick, freight elevator shafts wide enough to move armored vehicles, and a subfloor reinforcement grid that had once supported pallets of industrial cargo and now supported display platforms holding objects that weighed less but mattered more than anything that had ever passed through customs. Ilara had been running it for 9 years. She knew every case, every mount, every object in the permanent collection by catalog number, acquisition date, and provenance chain. She could walk the galleries blindfolded and name each piece by the sound her shoes made on the floor in front of it, the slight difference in resonance where the subfloor reinforcements had been installed to support the heavier artifacts, the way the acoustic signature shifted between Gallery 4's Keith Ronnie ceramics and Gallery 5's Tessarine navigation instruments. She was thorough. She was meticulous. She was, by her own private admission, obsessive in a way that had cost her a marriage Thomas had left after the 3rd consecutive anniversary dinner. She had canceled to attend to a humidity spike in Gallery 6 most of her friendships, and any realistic hope of a social life that did not involve climate-controlled rooms and objects behind glass. Her younger sister called her once a month and spent most of the conversation trying to set her up with divorced colleagues. Ilara listened politely, deflected skillfully, and went back to work. The collection was her life, not the administration of it, not the budgets, the board meetings, the quarterly donor cultivation events where she stood in a dress she hated and explained Tessarine metallurgy to people whose interest in the Vanthil was precisely proportional to their available tax deduction. The objects themselves, the silence inside them, the weight of what they had been before they arrived in her cases and became exhibits with placard descriptions and donation acknowledgments. She had built a life around that silence, and she did not regret it. What she regretted on the rare nights when she allowed herself the indulgence of self-pity, usually around 2 in the morning when the gallery lights were dimmed to their overnight settings, and the only sound was the climate control system cycling through its humidity adjustment, was that no one else seemed to hear it. The objects in her collection were not dead. They were dormant. They carried information in their material structure that no scan had fully captured, no analysis had fully decoded, no digital reproduction could convey. You had to be in the room with them. You had to sit with them, physically, in their presence, and pay the kind of attention that could not be rushed or delegated or replicated by an algorithm. Ilara had tried to explain this to the board of directors exactly once, at a budget meeting 3 years ago, when they had proposed digitizing the permanent collection and reducing the gallery's physical footprint to save on climate control costs. She had argued that digital reproductions, however high resolution, could not capture the material properties that made the objects scientifically significant. The board had listened politely, approved a reduced digitization budget as a compromise, and moved on to the next agenda item. The deputy chair, a retired venture capitalist whose understanding of cultural preservation was limited to the phrase measurable impact, had taken her aside afterward and suggested that she consider framing the value proposition more accessibly. She had gone back to Gallery 7 that night and sat with the Codex until dawn. The crack appeared in the Orindal Codex. It sat in Gallery 7, the smallest and quietest of the Vanthel's exhibition spaces, a climate-sealed room with charcoal gray walls, a single bench for visitors who rarely sat on it, and recessed lighting calibrated to minimize UV exposure while maintaining the warm, even illumination that Alara had spent 2 weeks adjusting when the Codex first arrived. The gallery received perhaps 30 visitors on a busy day, most of whom glanced at the Codex's display placard, read the words untranslated alien manuscript, estimated age 93,000 standard years, and moved on to Gallery 8, where the Tessarine war masks were more photogenic and the gift shop sold miniature replicas. The Codex was not photogenic. It was, to the uninstructed eye, a closed book sitting on a pedestal behind glass, unremarkable in shape, modest in scale, its pale composite covers showing no ornamentation, no color, no visual drama. Visitors who lingered long enough to read the full placard learned that it had been recovered from a dead moon in the Paulith system, and that its script remained untranslated. Most of them took a photograph, checked the gallery map for the exit, and left. It was the most important object in the building. Alara had known that from the day it arrived, and the knowledge had been eating her alive ever since. The Codex was a bound volume roughly the size of a human atlas, its covers carved from a pale composite material that no materials scientist had been able to identify. Not ceramic, not polymer, not metal, not glass. Something that shared structural characteristics with all four and matched none of them in its crystalline microstructure. A team at MIT had spent 6 months analyzing a microscopic sample taken from the edge of the back cover, the only physical sample the Concord had authorized, and had produced a 90-page report whose conclusion amounted to, "We do not know what this is." The material appeared to be simultaneously organic and inorganic, with a crystal lattice that contained internal channels too regular to be natural and too complex to be fabricated by any known process. Its interior consisted of 41 pages made of a similar substance, thin, flexible, each one carrying dense columns of script that ran in spiraling patterns from the page's center outward. The script had never been translated. 3 generations of computational linguists, xenolinguists, and pattern recognition algorithms at institutions across Earth, and 4 conquered worlds had failed to produce a single verified reading. The Tessarines had tried first, with their deep tradition of comparative xenolinguistics. Then the Palshi, whose mathematical approach to language decryption had broken 11 other ancient scripts. Then the Keithrani, whose cultural memory extended further back than any other living species. Then a Vashiri trading house scholar who had published a controversial paper, arguing that the script was not linguistic at all, but musical annotation for sound patterns rather than semantic content. That theory had gained traction for 2 years before a detailed spectral analysis showed no correlation between the script structure and any known acoustic framework. The leading theory, the one Alara considered least wrong, was that the script was a schematic, a set of instructions encoded in a notation system that presupposed knowledge the reader already possessed, not a message for the uninitiated, a manual for the already prepared. Instructions for what? No one could say. The Tessarine xenolinguist who had spent the most time with the Codex, a scholar named Eve Call, who had published 3 monographs on the subject before retiring in what her colleagues described as frustrated exhaustion, had called the script a door with no handle. The notation was internally consistent, she wrote. It followed rules. It had structure, hierarchy, repetition, and variation. It was clearly designed to convey information. But the information required a context that no living species possessed, and without that context, The structure was as meaningful as a lock without a key. The Codex had been recovered from a sealed chamber beneath the surface of Velar Den, a dead moon orbiting the gas giant Paulith Major, during a Concord-supervised archaeological survey 11 years ago. The chamber had been cut into the moon's basalt bedrock, not drilled, not blasted, cut, with a precision that suggested tools capable of manipulating molecular bonds at the atomic level. Clean walls. 90-degree angles held to tolerances that made the survey team's lead geologist sit down on the chamber floor and refuse to speak for 20 minutes. Inside the chamber, the Codex on a pedestal of the same pale composite as its covers, sitting in a shallow depression shaped precisely to its dimensions and nothing else. No secondary artifacts, no biological remains, no inscriptions on the walls, no contextual clues of any kind, just the book and the room that had been made to hold it, sealed for what the survey team's potassium argon and electron spin resonance dating estimated at 93,000 years. 93,000 years. The number still made Alara's chest tight when she let herself think about it. Homo sapiens had been painting on cave walls for roughly that long. Whatever civilization had carved that chamber and placed that book inside it had done so before humanity had invented the idea of a written word, before the concept of recording knowledge had occurred to any mind on Earth. The conquered of free peoples had assigned the Codex to Earth's custody as part of a cultural exchange allocation, one of 27 such allocations made that year, distributing unreadable or contextually orphaned artifacts to member worlds for preservation and study. Alara suspected the assignment had more to do with the conquered's inability to read the Codex than with any genuine desire to share it. They had exhausted their own experts. They had run every algorithm. They had convened 3 interspecies working groups, each of which had published findings, and none of which had advanced the translation by a single verified character. So they had given it to the humans, let them try. The youngest species in the conquered, the ones with the least xenolinguistic experience, the ones whose primary contribution to galactic scholarship so far had been an enthusiasm for brute force computational approaches that the older species found endearing in the way that an adult finds a child's confidence endearing. A long shot, dressed up as cultural generosity. The allocation had come with conditions. The Codex was to be maintained in a climate-controlled environment matching the specifications of its original chamber, temperature, humidity, UV exposure, atmospheric composition, all held within narrow tolerances. A conquered contracted monitoring specialist would be stationed on site to observe and report. The Codex was not to be physically handled without authorization from the Heritage Oversight Bureau. No invasive sampling beyond the single microscopic fragment already taken for materials analysis. No exposure to directed energy sources above a specified threshold. And most importantly, no public claims of translation or interpretation without peer review by a minimum of 3 Concord-accredited xenolinguistic institutions. Alara had followed every condition to the letter. She had built the display environment in Gallery 7 herself, calibrating the lighting over 2 weeks, testing the atmospheric seals, installing the microstrain sensors in the mounting platform at her own recommendation. The Bureau hadn't required them, but she wanted them. She had treated the Codex with the same meticulous care she gave every object in the collection, which is to say, with the absolute, unyielding, borderline obsessive attention to physical detail that had made her the best conservator the Vanthil had ever employed before she became its worst attending donor events director. In the first 3 years of Earth custody, a rotating series of visiting scholars had come to study the Codex in person. Alara had hosted each one, cleared the gallery for private sessions, provided equipment, stood in the doorway and watched. A Tessarine computational linguist named Aurel Fan had spent 4 weeks running frequency analyses on high-resolution page scans, producing charts of character distribution that covered every wall of the Vanthil's conference room. A Palshi mathematician had built a three-dimensional spatial model of the notation structure and declared it geometrically elegant but semantically opaque. A pair of human cryptographers from the signals intelligence community had spent 6 days in Gallery 7 with classified-grade pattern recognition hardware and left without publishing their findings, which Alara interpreted as meaning they had found nothing publishable. An elderly Keithrani heritage scholar, a woman whose ceremonial vestments and quiet authority had made the Vanthil security staff instinctively straighten their posture, had sat in front of the Codex for 3 hours in complete silence, risen, touched the display glass once with 2 fingers and told Alara, "The book is waiting, not for me." That conversation had stayed with Alara longer than any of the scholarly analyses. The Keithrani scholar had not elaborated. She had left the gallery, returned to her delegation, and departed Earth on the next scheduled transport. But the certainty in her voice, the absolute, unqualified certainty that the Codex was engaged in an active process of waiting, and that the object of its patience had not yet arrived, had planted something in Alara that grew slowly, stubbornly, and with increasing weight over the following 6 years. Alara had been trying for 9 years. Not publicly, she wasn't a linguist, and the Vanthil's official position was that the Codex was a cultural treasure to be preserved and displayed, not a puzzle to be solved by its custodian. But privately, in the hours after the gallery closed and the security staff settled into their overnight routines, and the building's climate control system dropped to its nighttime settings, she sat in Gallery 7 with her tablet and her notes and her growing archive of observations, and she studied it. She had not studied it the way the linguists had. That distinction was important, and she had spent years trying to articulate it to herself before giving up and simply doing it. The linguists focused on the script, the characters, their frequency, their spatial relationships, the mathematical patterns in their distribution across the 41 pages. They photographed the pages. They scanned them. They digitized the script and fed it to algorithms. They treated the Codex as a container for its writing. Alara had studied the object, the physical Codex itself, the way the pages lay against one another, the slight variations in how they settled, the microgaps between certain leaves that suggested the material was not uniformly dense, the way the composite covers had been shaped not by casting or molding, but by something that left no tool marks at all, as though the material had been persuaded into its form rather than forced. The way certain pages were slightly thicker than others at specific locations, with density variations that the MIT materials team had noted in their report, but flagged as manufacturing irregularities rather than intentional features. Alara did not believe they were irregularities. She believed they were architecture. She had found things, small things that she recorded in a personal notebook, not her professional log, not the Vanthil's conservation records, but a plain hardcover journal she kept in the bottom drawer of her desk, its pages filling slowly with observations written in a handwriting that got smaller and more precise as the years passed, as though the act of recording was itself becoming more careful. The findings might mean nothing to anyone who was not spending 4 nights a week alone in a darkened gallery with a polarizing filter and a magnifying lens. But they accumulated, month after month, year after year, observation after observation, and the pattern they formed, if it was a pattern, and she was increasingly certain it was pointed in a direction that made her both exhilarated and terrified. The script on page 23, when viewed at a specific angle under polarized light, cast shadows that formed a secondary pattern on the page beneath it. The composite material was not uniformly opaque. It had internal structures, the channels the MIT team had documented, the crystalline inclusions that ran through every page in pathways too regular to be accidental, that interacted with directed light in ways the surface alone could not explain. Light entered the page through the script characters, traveled along the internal channels, and emerged from the underside in a different configuration. The script was a lens. Each character focused and redirected the light that passed through it. Alara had spent 4 months mapping those shadow patterns on page 23. She had photographed them from 11 angles under 3 different polarization settings. She had digitized the composite shadow image and run it through every geographical comparison tool she could access. And on a Thursday night in March, sitting in gallery 7 at 2 in the morning, with the comparison results on her tablet and her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the screen, she had identified a match. The shadow pattern matched the topographical contours of a coastline, not an alien coastline, Earth's coastline, the western edge of the Mediterranean from the Strait of Gibraltar to the Gulf of Sidra, rendered in a projection system she did not recognize but could identify by its landmarks, the curve of the Iberian Peninsula, the notch of the Ligurian coast, the indentation of the Gulf of Gabs, the broad sweep of the North African shore. She had told no one, not her colleagues, not the Concord's Heritage Oversight Bureau, which had the legal right to be informed of any significant findings related to exchange-allocated artifacts, not her sister, who would not have understood, not anyone. The professional response to the claim that a 93,000-year-old alien codex contained a hidden map of Earth's Mediterranean coastline would be a polite suggestion that she take a leave of absence and speak with someone qualified to address stress-related pattern recognition in isolated researchers. She would have made the same suggestion herself if someone had brought the finding to her desk. But the map was there. She had verified it. It was not pareidolia. It was not an accident of crystalline structure. It was not wishful thinking rendered in shadow. Something had encoded a recognizable feature of Earth's geography into the internal structure of the Codex's 23rd page, 93 millennia before any human had drawn a map of anything. That discovery had changed everything. Before the coastline, Alara had been a careful, methodical, privately curious curator who spent extra hours with an interesting artifact. After the coastline, she was something else. The word she used in her own mind, when she was honest enough to use it, was obsessed. The word she feared was correct, on the nights when her confidence wavered and the gallery walls seemed to press inward with the weight of what she might be imagining, was delusional. She began checking every page under polarized light, mapping shadow patterns, photographing internal structures at magnifications that pushed the gallery's imaging equipment to its limits. She purchased a second polarizing filter with her own money when the Vanthill's budget couldn't accommodate it. She taught herself basic spectroscopic analysis from an online course offered by the Paulith Archaeological Institute. She cataloged the internal channel network across all 41 pages, mapping each pathway in 3 dimensions, tracing the connections between pages where the channels aligned across the microgaps between leaves. She tracked the density variations. She measured the microgaps and plotted them against the channel pathways, and found correlations that made her put her head down on the display case and breathe slowly, until her hands stopped shaking. She found more. Page 9 contained what appeared to be a stellar coordinate reference, a cluster of internal inclusions arranged in a spatial pattern that matched a known star group in the galactic arm. Page 31 held a density gradient whose cross-sectional profile corresponded to the layered structure of Earth's atmosphere, troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, with the ratios matching paleoatmospheric models for the late Pleistocene. Page 14 showed interference patterns in its crystalline lattice that corresponded, within a margin she found almost unbearable, to the harmonic frequencies of human speech. Each discovery widened the gap between what she knew and what she could prove. Each one pushed her further into isolation. Her sister stopped calling monthly and started calling weekly, her voice carrying the careful brightness of someone who suspects a family member is in trouble but cannot name the specific kind. Alara's assistant curator, a competent but incurious man named Paul who managed the Vanthill's traveling exhibitions, had begun leaving healthy lunches on her desk with post-it notes that said things like, "You were here until 3 a.m. again," And the cleaning crew says you talk to the displays. She ate the lunches and ignored the notes. She was a curator holding a secret that was too large for her title and too strange for her institution, and she carried it alone because there was no one she trusted enough to hand it to. Not because she feared ridicule, she had endured worse than ridicule in 22 years of museum work, because she feared being right. If the Codex contained what she thought it contained, the implications were so vast that they would be taken from her hands the moment she spoke them aloud. The Codex would be transferred to a dedicated research facility. The Vanthil would lose custody. She would lose access. And whatever the Codex was trying to say, because she had become increasingly certain in the deep private hours that it was trying to say something, that the hidden structures were not passive data but an active, patient attempt at communication, would be subjected to exactly the kind of analysis that had already failed. Linguistic, computational, algorithmic. The analysis of experts who studied the script and ignored the book. She could not let that happen, not yet. Not until she understood enough to guide the conversation. And then, on a Tuesday morning in October, while she was kneeling on the floor of the conservation room cleaning a display case that held nothing important, the crack appeared. It started as a hairline fracture in the composite of the front cover, running diagonally from the upper left corner toward the spine. Alara saw it on the gallery's environmental monitoring feed, a sudden spike in the microstrain sensors embedded in the display case's mounting platform. She pulled up the visual feed on her tablet and saw the line, thin as a thread, luminous. Not a crack in the material's integrity, not the beginning of structural failure. A crack in whatever had been holding the material sealed. She was in Gallery 7 within 4 minutes, the brush still in her gloved hand, her reading glasses still on her forehead. The Codex was glowing. Not brightly, not the aggressive luminescence of a powered device coming online. A warmth, a suffusion. The hairline fracture was emitting a pale golden light that seeped into the composite's surface and illuminated the internal structures she had spent years trying to map under polarized light. She could see them now without instruments, the channels, the crystalline threads, the lattice of inclusions that ran through every page, and both covers, lit from within like a vascular system, suddenly filled with warm blood. Alara stood in front of the case and did not move. 9 years. 9 years of late nights and polarized light and shadow maps, and the growing, isolating, ungovernable certainty that she was either the most patient researcher in the building or the most deluded. 9 years of finding coastlines and star charts and atmospheric profiles hidden inside an object that the rest of the galaxy had dismissed as an interesting but insoluble artifact. And now the object was changing, on its own. Without intervention, without stimulus, without any action on her part beyond showing up, Tuesday after Tuesday, night after night, and looking. Her hands were shaking. She clenched them at her sides and forced herself to breathe in the measured cadence she used when handling fragile objects. 4 counts in, hold for 2, 4 counts out. It did not help. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, and her vision was narrowing at the edges, with a focus so acute it was almost painful. She was aware, in the small professional compartment of her mind that remained functional, that she should not be standing this close to a case containing an artifact in active transition. The conservation protocols she had written herself, the protocols that hung framed on the wall of her office, that she had enforced with the unflinching severity that had earned her a reputation among junior staff as someone who did not tolerate compromise, specified that any observed change in an artifact's physical state required an immediate withdrawal to safe distance, notification of the monitoring specialist, and a minimum 30-minute observation period before any approach. She did not withdraw, she did not even step back. 9 years of sitting with this object in the dark, 9 years of finding hidden coastlines and star charts and atmospheric profiles, 9 years of the growing, private, inarticulate certainty that the Codex was not inert, that it was present, aware, engaged in something she could not name but could feel the edges of every time she sat close enough and stayed long enough, and paid the right kind of attention. Those 9 years had purchased this moment, and she was not going to observe it from a safe distance. The security system would have flagged the microstrain spike already. The overnight monitor, a Concord contracted Tessarine named Dren Savath, stationed at the Vanthil as part of the cultural exchange agreement, would be reviewing the alert in the operations room downstairs. She had maybe 3 minutes before he arrived. She leaned close to the display glass and studied the fracture. The golden light was intensifying not in brightness, but in depth. The channels inside the composite were filling sequentially, like a circuit being energized one pathway at a time, each pathway activating the next in a cascade that moved from the fracture point toward the spine and from the spine into the pages. The script on the front cover, static for 93 millennia, beautiful, precise, dead, was beginning to respond. Individual characters were catching the internal light and refracting it outward in tiny points that cast faint patterns on the inside of the display glass. The patterns were not random. They were the same script, the same spiraling notation, but arranged differently, smaller, tighter, compressed, as though the Codex's front cover was projecting a condensed version of its own contents onto the nearest available surface. She could feel the glass vibrating under her palms, a hum not audible, tactile, a frequency that lived in the material of the case and traveled through her nitrile gloves into the bones of her hands. Dr. Sung. Dren Savath's voice came from the gallery entrance. She did not turn around. "I see it," she said. "Come in, close the door behind you." Dren entered Gallery 7 the way he entered every room, quietly. His tall frame folded into the precise posture that Tessarines adopted in spaces they considered culturally significant. He was a monitoring specialist, not a researcher. His job was to observe, record, and report any changes in the condition of exchange-allocated artifacts to the Concord's Heritage Oversight Bureau. He had been stationed at the Vanthil for 3 years, and in that time he had filed exactly 0 incident reports because nothing had ever happened. His bureau superiors had suggested twice that he request transfer to a more active posting. He had declined both times, for reasons he had never explained to Alara and that she had never asked about, because they were both professionals who understood that some attachments to quiet places did not require justification. He crossed the gallery floor in 4 long strides and stopped beside her. His triple-lidded eyes gray-green, the inner lid cycling with a rapid flutter that Tessarines exhibited under high cognitive load, fixed on the Codex. "Microstrain alert at 9:11, he said. Fracture appeared spontaneously, no external stimulus, no environmental deviation, temperature, humidity, UV all nominal. I know. Concord protocol for spontaneous artifact activation is immediate isolation and notification. I know the protocol, Dren. Are you going to let me follow it?" She looked at him. Beneath his professional composure she could read the subtleties, the dilation of his outer eyelids, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers were interlocked rather than loosely folded behind his back. He was riveted. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. "Then call whoever you need to call." He studied her for a long moment. Then he pulled the observation chair from the alcove and sat down. 9 minutes, he said. "I'm timing." Alara turned back to the Codex. The golden light had spread. The fracture had widened not as a crack widens, with material failing, but as a channel widens, accommodating a greater flow. The pale composite was becoming translucent along the fracture line, the crystalline lattice visible through the surface like veins beneath sunlit skin, and the script was moving. Not rearranging, not shifting position, blooming. Each character was expanding outward from its center, the strokes thickening and splitting into subcomponents that had been nested inside the original forms, invisible until the internal light reached them. What had appeared to be single characters were clusters, compressed notations that required activation energy to unfold. "The characters are compound," she whispered. "They're layered. The surface script is a summary, a compressed index. The real content is inside each character, folded into the stroke structure. The linguists were trying to translate the table of contents." Dren was on his feet again, at her shoulder. "You're saying the Codex was designed to be unreadable until it activated." "I'm saying it was designed to be unreadable until it decided to be read." "Objects don't decide. This one is deciding right now." The golden light pulsed. Once. A single wave that traveled the fracture line, reached the spine and crossed into the interior. Through the glass, they watched the pages respond, each leaf catching the pulse, amplifying it, the crystalline channels carrying the light forward in cascading waves from front cover to back in exactly 3 seconds. The Codex lit up like a nerve firing. Then it opened. Not violently. The front cover lifted on its own, rising with the slow, deliberate motion of something that had been waiting a very long time. It opened to the first page and settled there, the composite hinge flexing without sound. The first page was cleared. The script had migrated to the edges, forming a dense ornamental border around an empty central space. The space was luminous, a field of golden light from the crystalline lattice beneath the surface, and hovering half a centimeter above that light was a holographic rendering of a planet. Earth. Alara's knees buckled. She caught herself on the display case's edge and held on, white-knuckled, staring at the small, rotating world suspended in golden light above page 1. The Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa, the Boot of Italy, the Bay of Bengal, the jagged coast of Norway. The planet rotated slowly, its features rendered in topographical detail that included mountain ranges, river systems, and coastlines with a precision that no satellite had captured 93,000 years ago, because there had been no satellites. Nothing on Earth's surface but grassland and ice, and small bands of humans who had not yet learned to domesticate grain. "Dr. Sung," Dren said. His voice had lost every trace of neutrality. "That is Earth." "Yes." "The Codex is projecting a holographic map of Earth." "Yes." "The Codex is 93,000 years old." "Yes." Dren sat down, not in the chair on the floor, his back against the wall, his inner eyelids cycling so fast they were nearly transparent. He pressed his palms flat against the concrete, as though he needed the solidity. The holographic Earth continued to rotate. As it turned, points of light appeared on its surface, small, precise, golden. Dozens of them, concentrated along coastlines and river valleys in patterns that Alara recognized with a physical shock. The Mediterranean, the Nile Delta, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Gulf of Mexico, the highlands of Mesoamerica, the river systems of sub-Saharan Africa. Every major cradle of human civilization. Every place where, thousands of years after this codex was sealed on a dead moon, human beings would independently develop agriculture, writing, and cities. The golden points pulsed with a gentle rhythm, each one carrying the same patient light that the fracture had emitted, the light of something that had been waiting to show this, to someone, for an incomprehensible span of time. Alara counted the points, 27 major markers, dozens of smaller secondary indicators. The density was highest around the Mediterranean, her Mediterranean, the coastline she had found in the shadow patterns on page 23, the discovery that had started everything. The Codex had shown her the answer to her 5 years of secret research in the first 10 seconds of its awakening. It knew, Alara said, her voice cracking on the second word. It knew where we would build. It mapped every site where civilization would emerge. 93,000 years before the first settlement was founded. Dren's breathing was audible from the floor. Shallow, rapid. the respiratory pattern of a tessarine whose cognitive processing had exceeded the capacity of their normal autonomic regulation. The page turned on its own. The second page showed an older Earth, sea levels lower, continental shelves exposed, land bridges visible. An Earth from the deep Pleistocene, rendered with the same precision. A different set of golden points marked locations that carried no historical weight. The Saharan interior when it had been green savanna. The floor of what was now the North Sea. Points deep in the Antarctic interior, buried under kilometers of ice. Older sites. Sites predating anything in the human archaeological record by tens of thousands of years. The page turned again. A star field. Not a decorative rendering, not an artist's impression of a night sky, but a navigational chart with coordinate markers and trajectory lines and timestamp notations in the compound script, now partially unfolded by the golden light. A working document. A route plan. The professional instrument of a civilization that traveled between stars the way mariners traveled between continents methodically, with charts and waypoints and planned stops. The route started deep in the galactic arm, at a point surrounded by a cluster of notations dense enough to suggest a home base or a departure hub. It wound outward through dozens of star systems, each one marked with a small golden circle that indicated a survey stop, a system visited, data collected, observations recorded, assessments made. The route was not straight. It was iterative, spiraling, the path of a search that was refining its criteria as it traveled, narrowing its focus with each stop, homing in on something specific. And it terminated at a small yellow star on the arm's outer edge. A star with a third planet that carried 27 golden markers on its surface and a codex on its nearest dead moon. So, they came here on purpose, Alara whispered. This wasn't an accident. They planned a route. They surveyed other systems first, dozens of them, and then they came to Sol, to Earth. And they stayed. Dren shifted on the floor. His voice was strained but functional, the monitoring specialist reasserting itself through the shock. The survey waypoints, can you count them? Alara leaned closer and counted the golden circles along the route. 47 systems surveyed before Earth, and the trajectory, look at how it narrows. The early waypoints are spread across a wide search area. The later ones converge. They were refining their search, looking for something specific, and they found it here. What were they looking for? She did not answer because the page was already turning. Page 4 showed a geological cross-section of Earth's crust at 3 different survey sites, with mineral deposits and tectonic boundaries mapped in golden schematic lines. Page 5 rendered the orbital mechanics of the Sol system with trajectories for every major body, annotated with timestamps that covered a monitoring period of what appeared to be several centuries. Page 6 displayed Earth's ocean currents in layered holographic flows, each current traced in a different shade of gold. The thermohaline circulation, rendered as a 3-dimensional pulse that moved through the projected ocean like a heartbeat. They had studied everything, not a cursory survey, not a probe dropped into orbit and retrieved. A sustained, meticulous, multi-century study of Earth and its systems, conducted by a civilization with the patience and the technology to sit in a solar system for generations and watch a planet breathe. Page 9, the page whose internal structure Alara had matched to a stellar coordinate reference, projected the same star group she had identified, but now it was contextualized. The coordinate reference was Earth's position in the galactic arm, marked with a notation that pulsed differently from the survey waypoints. Not a stop on the route, a destination, a pin in the map with a flag beside it. They had not passed through Sol. They had come to Sol. Earth was not a data point, it was the point. The pages turned faster now. Each one revealed a new layer of the survey. Page 10 showed atmospheric compositions tracked across millennial time scales, oxygen ratios, carbon cycles, trace element concentrations, all mapped in holographic cross-sections that pulsed with the slow rhythms of planetary respiration. Page 11 displayed tectonic plate movements modeled forward and backward through deep time, the continents drifting apart and together in golden animation, mountain ranges rising and eroding, ocean basins opening and closing. Page 12 rendered Earth's magnetic field as a three-dimensional lattice of force lines, and Alara noticed, with a jolt that felt like electricity, that the field's reversal history was annotated. They had watched the magnetic poles flip. They had been present, or had data covering magnetic events that predated the Codex itself. Page 13 was biological. Earth's Pleistocene ecosystems rendered in holographic detail so precise that Alara could identify individual species. Megafauna she recognized from paleontological reconstructions: woolly mammoths, cave bears, giant ground sloths, their body plans rendered with a fidelity that suggested direct observation rather than fossil inference. Hominid species long extinct Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo erectus shown not as isolated specimens, but as populations, their territories mapped across continental surfaces, their migration patterns traced in colored lines that overlapped and diverged, and sometimes, in specific river valleys, converged. And modern humans. Small figures rendered not as specimens, but as subjects of sustained, careful, almost tender observation. Their migration patterns traced in golden lines across continental surfaces, branching and spreading like the root system of a tree growing in accelerated time. Their campsites marked with tiny indicators that pulsed with the same patient light as the civilization cradle points on page 1. "They watched us," Dren said from the floor. His voice had gone very quiet. "For generations, they sat in this system and they watched us." "They studied us," Alara corrected. "There's a difference. Watching is passive. This was scholarship. The most thorough scholarship I've ever seen." Page 14, the page whose crystalline lattice matched the harmonic frequencies of human speech, projected a detailed schematic of the acoustic properties of human vocalization. Not just the physical mechanics of speech production, larynx, vocal tract, tongue placement, but the neural architecture that turned those mechanics into language. The fundamental frequency ranges, the harmonic series, the formant patterns that distinguished one vowel from another, one consonant from the next. The relationship between acoustic signal and semantic processing. They had analyzed human speech at a level that went beyond phonetics into the physics of how sound became meaning in a human mind. They had mapped the bridge between vibration and thought. Alara realized, with a clarity that felt like cold water on her face, that the Codex's untranslatable script made sense now. The notation system wasn't designed to encode human language. It was designed to encode the process by which human language worked, the cognitive mechanism, not the content. It was a schematic for the bridge itself. Page 15 stopped her breathing entirely. It displayed a functional schematic of a human brain, not anatomy, not the gross structures that any medical textbook would show. The neural pathways associated with pattern recognition, symbolic reasoning, and spatial mapping, rendered with a specificity that suggested direct observation at a resolution no human imaging technology had achieved. Neural connections traced individually like the threads of a tapestry, each one glowing with its own shade of gold. The schematic pulsed in specific regions, highlighting the structures and connections that corresponded to the cognitive capacities that made humans unique among Earth species. Not intelligence in the general sense. Many species on Earth had intelligence, something more specific, the capacity to see a landscape and imagine a city, to hear a sound and imagine a word, to look at the night sky and imagine a map, to hold in the mind a representation of something that did not yet exist and work toward making it real. The capacity to be cartographers. "They were studying us," Alara said. The words came slowly, each one weighted with the effort of saying something she had suspected for years and never been able to articulate, even to herself. Before we had language, before we had tools beyond shaped stone, before the first human looked at the night sky and thought to name a star, they mapped the neural architecture that would produce civilization, and they recognized it for what it was. Dren's voice came from the floor, barely controlled. Recognized it as what? Potential. The same kind of potential a geologist recognizes in a watershed. You look at the terrain, the slopes, the soil composition, the rainfall patterns, the gradient of the bedrock beneath the surface, and you can predict where the river will run, where the fertile valley will form, where the first settlement will grow. Not because you can see the future, but because you understand the present well enough to know what it will produce. They did the same thing with minds. They looked at the neural terrain of a pre-linguistic species on a mid-range terrestrial planet and predicted where the civilizations would emerge. And they were right. Every single golden point on page 1, every civilization cradle they marked 93,000 years ago, became exactly what they predicted. She heard Dren's sharp intake of breath. A tessarine processing sound, but sharper than usual, edged with something that was not professional composure. The tessarine civilization is 11,000 years old, he said. We consider ourselves ancient. The Keithrani are older 23,000 years. We consider them the elders of the conquered. He paused. These cartographers were surveying this galaxy before any living civilization existed. Yes. And they chose to study humanity. They chose to study the place where humanity would be. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Alara had ever heard in Gallery 7. Pages 16 through 22 showed the methodology, not raw data methodology. The conceptual framework that the cartographers had used to transform observation into prediction, measurement into map. Page 16 displayed what appeared to be a decision matrix, a grid of variables cross-referenced against outcomes, with probability gradients rendered as flowing color fields that shifted from deep amber to pale gold. The variables were beyond Alara's ability to read, but the structure was unmistakable. This was a formalized predictive model, a system for evaluating the likelihood that a given set of biological and environmental conditions would produce organized intelligence, and for forecasting the locations and time frames in which that intelligence would manifest as civilization. Page 17 broke the model into its component analytical dimensions: genetic diversity mapping, climate cycle modeling, resource distribution analysis, social group dynamics, neurological capacity assessment. Each dimension was rendered as its own holographic layer, and as the page's projection stabilized, the layers began to merge, stacking on top of one another like transparencies on a light table, each one adding information, each one refining the prediction, until the composite image that emerged was a map. Not a map of what existed, but a map of what would exist. A predictive geography of intelligence, drawn 93,000 years before its territory came into being. Pages 18 through 20 showed the same analysis applied to other worlds. 3 other planets, rendered in the same golden holographic detail as Earth, each one carrying its own set of civilization cradle markers, but the markers were sparser. The color gradients were thinner. The probability fields were narrower. Whatever criteria the cartographers were measuring, Earth exceeded them by a margin that was visible even without being able to read the notation. Earth's map was denser, brighter, more saturated with potential than any of the comparison worlds. Pages 21 and 22 were summative. Comparative tables, rankings, assessments. The notation was impenetrable, but the holographic projections included visual indicators that were clearly hierarchical scales, gradients, positional rankings. And in every visualization, every comparative framework, every summary assessment, Earth occupied the highest position, the top of every ranking, the densest point on every map, the richest field on every survey. Alara realized she was gripping the edge of the display case so hard that her knuckles ached. She forced her fingers to relax. Beside her, Dren had risen from the floor at some point, she had not noticed when, and was standing with his arms wrapped around his own torso, hands gripping his opposite elbows, the Tessarine posture of involuntary self-steadying that she had seen only once before, at a heritage ceremony on the Tessarine home world, where a 10,000-year-old cultural recording had been played for the first time in living memory. "We are watching the survey notes of a civilization older than any we have encountered," Dren said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "And according to their notes, the species they considered most promising in the galaxy is mine." Alara looked at him. "Yours." He met her eyes. "Humanity's, I meant yours." He paused. "Though I suspect, given what we are watching, that the distinction may matter less than we think." And then page 23, her page. The page she had studied for 4 months under polarized light. The page whose shadow patterns had shown her the Mediterranean coastline and started the cascade of secret discoveries that had consumed 5 years of her life and driven her to the edge of a professional isolation so complete that some nights, sitting alone in gallery 7 at 2 in the morning, she had wondered whether the silence she was studying had begun to study her back. The holographic projection above page 23 changed. It was no longer a map or a survey or a schematic. It was a message. The script that had bordered the page contracted inward, collapsing into a single dense block at the center. The block pulsed once, twice, and unfolded the layered subcomponents, separating into readable sequences that arranged themselves in the golden light in slow, deliberate spirals, each character unfolding individually, as though the Codex was taking extraordinary care with this particular passage, as though it wanted to be understood. Alara could not read the notation. She had no training in alien script analysis, no mathematical key, no framework for decoding an unknown notation system. But as she stared at the unfolded text, she understood it. Not the characters, not the grammar, the meaning. The intention behind the notation was bleeding through like light through the crystalline channels, not as language, but as something beneath language, at the level where comprehension existed before words were invented to carry it. The schematic on page 15 had mapped the neural pathways. This message was using them. The Codex was not a book, it was an interface, and it was interfacing with her. The understanding arrived whole, the way a landscape resolves when fog lifts, not piece by piece, but all at once, the entire terrain visible in a single moment of clearing. "We came to your world before you had words. We studied the bright thread in your biology, the capacity you carry for pattern, for sequence, for the architecture of meaning. We saw what you would build before you built it. We mapped the places where your hands would first press seeds into soil, where your voices would first carry across water, where your marks on stone would first become thought made visible. We were cartographers. We traveled the galaxy mapping civilizations the way others map continents, by reading the terrain and predicting where the rivers would run. We charted the emergence of intelligence wherever we found its preconditions, and we sealed our records in the systems we surveyed, waiting for the minds we had predicted to grow into what we had seen in them. You were our finest map. Your world carried more markers of emergent intelligence than any site we surveyed in 11,000 years of travel. Every continent, every river basin, every coastline. The potential was dense and bright and present in every substrate we measured: genetic, neurological, ecological, geological. We knew, with the certainty that comes from having read 10,000 worlds, that what would grow here would be extraordinary. We left this record in your system's shadow, sealed against time and entropy. We left it for the one who would find the coastline in the shadow, the one who would sit with it in the quiet hours and look not at the script but at the object, the one who would study the thing itself and recognize that the silence was not empty. That is the cartographer's gift, to see what is not yet drawn, to read the map before the territory exists. If you are reading this, you have found the coastline. You have sat with the silence. You have earned the name we left here for you." Ilara was crying. She had not noticed when it started. The tears ran down her face and dropped onto her nitrile gloves, and she did not wipe them away because her hands were pressed flat against the display glass and she could not move them, could not break the contact. The Codex pulsed. The golden light in every channel, every crystalline thread, every layered character on every one of the 41 pages, all of it contracted inward. It gathered. It concentrated. It drew itself from the edges of the Codex into a single point at the center of page 23, and the point brightened and became a small, perfect sun, a golden star no larger than a marble, burning with steady, ancient, patient light. And from that star a voice spoke. Not sound, not vibration in the air. Something that entered through the same channel the understanding had come through, beneath language, beneath thought, at the level where meaning lived before it became words. Cartographer of the first silence. 4 words. They landed in Ilara's mind like a hand placed gently on her shoulder. Not a command, not a benediction, a recognition. The kind a teacher gives to a student who has finally, after years of quiet work, answered the question the teacher spent their life learning to ask. The golden sun expanded, and light flooded Gallery 7. Every page blazed. All 41 leaves illuminated simultaneously. The full unfolded content of their compound script expanded and alive. The crystalline channels in the display cases mounting platform channels built into the original pedestal on Velar Den, part of the Codex's architecture, dormant for 93,000 years, caught the light and carried it outward. Into the floor. Into the subfloor reinforcements, into the building's concrete bones. For perhaps 15 seconds, Gallery 7 was filled with the complete contents of the Orindal Codex, projected on every surface. Walls, ceiling, floor, display glass, the charcoal gray panels, the observation bench, the lenses of Ilara's reading glasses still pushed up on her forehead. A library of maps. The cartographic record of a civilization that had spent 11,000 years traveling the galaxy and mapping not planets, but potentials, the places where intelligence would crystallize, where order would emerge from chaos, where silence would find a voice. Earth was the masterpiece, the richest survey, the deepest study, the prediction they had staked their legacy on. And they had left the record for the one cartographer who would recognize it. The one mind, out of all the minds that their prediction had said this planet would produce, that would approach the Codex the way they had approached Earth, not with instruments, not with algorithms, not with the aggressive analytical confidence of a species trying to crack a code, but with patience, with attention, with the quiet, sustained material focus of someone who sat with objects in the silence and studied what they were, not just what they said. A curator. A cartographer who did not know she was a cartographer until the Codex told her. Dren Savath sat on the floor, his triple-lidded eyes fully open, all 3 lids retracted simultaneously, the deepest involuntary reverence his species could physically express, reserved for moments that exceeded the mind's capacity to categorize. His mouth was open, his hands pressed flat against the concrete. He did not speak. The golden light held for another 30 seconds. Then it folded. The projections contracted back into the pages. The unfolded characters compressed back into their compound forms. The crystalline channels dimmed and went dark. The golden star contracted to a point and vanished. The front cover settled closed with the same slow, deliberate motion with which it had opened, and the fracture line sealed itself, the composite knitting together as though the crack had never existed. Gallery 7 was silent. Environmental monitors showed no anomaly. Temperature, humidity, UV exposure, atmospheric composition, all nominal, all within the tolerances Ilara had set 9 years ago when she built the display environment. The microstrain sensors registered 0. The display case's internal atmosphere was clean. The Codex sat in its case, closed and still and apparently unchanged, looking exactly as it had looked at 9 o'clock that morning, when Alara had passed through Gallery 7 on her way to the conservation room with her brush and her nitrile gloves. As though the last 20 minutes had been a hallucination, as though nothing had happened. The silence in the gallery was enormous. Not the comfortable silence of an empty room, but the dense, charged silence that follows an event so significant that ordinary sound needs a moment to remember how to fill the space. Dren broke it first. He got to his feet slowly, using the wall for support, his long tessarine limbs unfolding with the careful deliberation of someone who is not certain his legs will hold him. He crossed to the display case and stood beside Alara, and for a long moment they simply looked at the Codex together, two professionals standing in front of an object they had cared for and monitored and lived alongside for years, seeing it now as something they had never imagined it could be. The micro-etchings, Dren said. He pointed at the display glass. On the inside surface, those were not there before. Alara's reading glasses carried faint traces of the projected script on their lenses. Micro-etchings burned into the glass by the light's intensity, and the display panel showed the same etching at every point where the notation had been projected. Physical evidence. The Codex had spoken, and it had left its handwriting on every surface it touched. Dr. Sung, Dren's voice was barely audible. The 9 minutes are long past. She almost laughed. It came out as a sound half breath, half sob. Call the Bureau. I need to report what I observed, the activation, the projections, the name. Alara turned to him. Her face was wet, her glasses askew, her nitrile gloves stained with tears and the faintest golden residue where her palms had pressed the glass during the illumination. She looked exactly like what she was, a 51-year-old museum curator who had just had the most important conversation of her life with a 93,000-year-old book. It said a name, she told him. It said mine. He stared. Not my name, she corrected, because precision mattered, because even now she would not be imprecise. The name it left here for me, the name I earned by finding the coastline. She looked at the Codex, closed, silent, still, having delivered its message, patient again. It occurred to her with a gentleness that surprised her that the Codex had been patient in a way that made every other patient she had ever known her own 9 years, the custodians who had guarded it before her, the tessarine scholar who had spent a career studying it, look like impatience. It had waded through the entire history of human civilization. Through agriculture and bronze and iron and gunpowder and flight and the stars. Through every stage of the journey, its creators had predicted, waiting for the species to produce the specific kind of mind that could meet it on its own terms. And here she was, a 51-year-old woman in nitrile gloves, standing in a converted warehouse in Boston, with tears drying on her face, and the handwriting of the oldest known civilization in the galaxy etched into her reading glasses. It was a survey team, she said. Not conquerors, not missionaries, not gods, cartographers. They traveled the galaxy mapping places where intelligence would emerge. They could read it in the biology, the geology, the climate patterns the way a master surveyor reads a watershed and knows where the village will be built 1,000 years from now. And Earth. Earth was the richest site they ever found. Every continent, every river valley. They knew what we would become before we were anything. And they left this Codex in our system because they believed the species they had mapped would eventually produce a mind that could find it and read it the way it was meant to be read. Not as a text. Not as a text, as a physical object with weight and structure and hidden geometry. Every xenolinguist who studied this Codex, the tessarines, the palshi, the Keithrani, the algorithms, every working group treated it as a container for script. They scanned the pages. They digitized the characters. They built computational models. And they failed because the notation system was not the point. The Codex itself was the point. The material, the internal architecture, the channels and crystalline lattice that you could only see by sitting with the physical object and paying the kind of attention that cannot be digitized or delegated. The linguists were trying to decode the writing. The Codex was waiting for someone who would study the book. Dren was quiet for a moment. Then the shadow of something that might have been a smile crossed his long tessarine face. "In 3 years," he said, "I have filed 0 incident reports. My bureau superiors have suggested twice that this posting is a dead end." He paused. "I am going to enjoy writing this one very much." Ilara looked at him. For the first time in years she smiled back, a real smile. "Write it well," she said. "The Codex will know if you get it wrong." He stared at her. She saw the moment when he understood that the joke and the truth occupied exactly the same space, and that this was the nature of what they had witnessed. The Codex was listening. It had always been listening. And the distinction between a joke about that fact and a statement of it was a distinction that only mattered to minds that had not yet been introduced to the reality of a patience, so vast it made geological time feel hasty. Dren nodded slowly. The nod carried a weight that was new, a gravity that had settled on him during the last 20 minutes like silt settling on a riverbed, layer by layer, until the landscape of his professional understanding had been permanently altered. "I will write it exactly as it happened," he said. "From the microstrain alert to the last pulse of light. I will describe the projections in the order they appeared. I will note the physical evidence, the microetchings on the glass, the golden residue on your gloves, the markings on your lenses. And I will record what the Codex said." Cartographer of the first silence. "Yes, I will record that," he hesitated. "Dr. Sung, in the Tessarine heritage tradition, when a sealed artifact activates in the presence of a specific individual, it is considered a recognition event. The individual is not honored for what they achieved. They are acknowledged for what they already were. The artifact does not create the connection. It reveals one that existed before the artifact was sealed." Ilara looked at him. His face was composed again, but his eyes, all 3 lids retracted. The full gray-green depth of his irises visible held something she had never seen in a Tessarine expression before. It was not reverence exactly. It was closer to gratitude. The gratitude of someone who has witnessed something they have been waiting their entire career to witness, even though they did not know, until the moment it happened, that they were waiting. "Thank you," she said, "for the 9 minutes. You needed more than 9 minutes. I know, thank you for not stopping me." He inclined his head, the Tessarine acknowledgement between equals. Then he pulled his tablet from his belt and began composing. Ilara turned back to the Codex. She rested her fingertips on the display glass gently, the way she touched every object in her care, with the quiet attention that was not method but something older. The microstrain sensors registered a brief, faint pulse. So brief that Dren, absorbed in his report, did not notice the indicator light flicker from green to gold and back. But Ilara noticed. She always noticed. The Codex was listening. It had been listening for 93,000 years, and now the person it was listening for had arrived. Not a translator, not a codebreaker, a woman who sat with objects in the quiet hours and studied the space between what was written and what was meant. A curator who had found a coastline hidden inside a shadow and had not told anyone, because the finding was too strange and too important to surrender before she understood what it asked of her. It asked this, to be the kind of mind that maps what is not yet visible, to see the potential in the silence and trust it enough to sit with it until it speaks. She had been that mind all along. The Codex had simply waited for her to prove it. Outside Gallery 7, the October sun pressed through the Vanthill's filtered skylights and laid long rectangles of warm light across the corridor floor. The building hummed with its ordinary systems, climate control, security feeds, the freight elevator carrying acquisitions to storage. The museum was alive with the quiet motion of an institution, built to hold things still long enough for the right person to look at them. Alara Sung stood in that stillness and felt it for what it was. The first silence. The silence before the map is drawn. The silence a cartographer learns to read, because the territory is already there, hidden in the terrain, waiting to be seen by someone patient enough to sit with it until it speaks. She had sat with it for 9 years. It had spoken. And the name it had given her was not a title or a reward. It was a recognition, the acknowledgement, across 93,000 years of sealed patience, that the map they had made of humanity's potential had been accurate. That the species they had studied before it had words had grown into exactly what they had predicted. And that one member of that species, kneeling on a conservation room floor with a brush in her hand, had proven the prediction by doing the one thing the Codex had been built to recognize. She had looked at the object, not the script, the object. She had read the silence. She had earned the name. Dren Savath filed his report at 11:47 that morning. It was 9 pages long. It contained a sentence the Heritage Oversight Bureau would quote for the next 200 years. The artifact did not activate because Dr. Sung decoded its contents. The artifact activated because Dr. Sung spent 9 years studying it the way its creators intended, not as a text to be translated, but as an object to be understood. The Codex did not recognize her credentials. It recognized her method. When the Bureau's senior analyst read that sentence, she set down her tablet and sat in silence for a long time. Then she opened a new file and typed 4 words as the subject line. Oriental Codex Reclassification, Immediate. Beneath it, one sentence: the artifact is not a text, it is a test, and the subject passed. She forwarded the report to the Bureau's director, the Concord's Xenoarchaeological Advisory Panel, and the heads of all 7 accredited xenolinguistic institutions. Then she opened the Vanthil Gallery's personnel file one more time, found the personal contact information for Dr. Alara Sung, and composed a brief, carefully worded message that said 3 things. That the Bureau acknowledged the significance of the Codex activation event, that the Codex would remain in the Vanthil's custody for the foreseeable future, and that Dr. Sung's continued role as primary custodian was, in the Bureau's assessment, not merely appropriate but essential. She sent the message and closed her tablet. Then she opened it again and added a postscript that she suspected was unnecessary but could not resist including. The Codex chose its custodian. We see no reason to overrule it. Back in Gallery 7, Alara Sung sat with her tablet open and her reading glasses finally on her face. The lenses still carried faint micro-etchings, golden traces that caught the light at certain angles and threw tiny patterns across her field of vision. The handwriting of a civilization that had believed in her species before her species believed in itself. She did not clean them off. She would never clean them off. They were the first marks on the first map of what came next, and the cartographer had already begun to read them.